Good morning and welcome to Women's Wednesday. I'm Brandy Stitt, the Program Director for the Women's Business Center, and we're very excited that you could join us. We are excited to have Erica Brune and Danielle Bearden back for another round of sessions for Lever1 as part of Women's Wednesdays. This week we're focused on recalling employees back, and next week we'll focus on recruiting employees, so very similar topics. I want to go ahead and let everyone know that we are recording this session, and these will be posted online for you to review later if you choose to do so or to share with other people. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Erica to get us started.
All right, good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's session is, as Brandy mentioned, recalling employees back to work. And boy, are we in an interesting time. A week ago, when we started finalizing this presentation, we anticipated many of our fellow business owners would be in the midst of recalls and businesses reopening. And I believe we're even close to the original phase out of the phasing of closing of businesses. And the situation has certainly changed for many parts of the country. While businesses are open and operating, there are still many cities and stepping back on the phasing system and surges of COVID positive cases during this pandemic. So we understand that each of you listening and watching this are probably in a different place than where you hoped, in a different place than what you thought even just a week ago, and the situation is changing daily. So we are going to do a deep dive today about if and when you're ready to recall employees, how to go about that process. And it seems fairly simple, just pick up the phone and let them know, hey, it's exciting, you know, we can start working again. But the reality is there is a lot more complexity to that, and we're going to talk through that. In addition, we're going to talk through all of the things to think about in terms of employee safety, employee morale, the CDC guidance for your business, and how to make sure you stay on top of that since the situation does change daily. And you may have already had people back at work, and here we go again with some new guidance. So we're going to cover all of that in today's session, and we sure appreciate you guys joining us. As Brandy mentioned, my name is Erica Brune, and I am president of Lever1, and I'm joined by my HR director, Danielle Bearden. Between the two of us, we have several decades of HR experience. We both work at a company called Lever1, which is a Kansas City-based professional employer organization. Lever1 services around 130 clients that make up 3,500 worksite employees. Our client base spans every state and pretty much every industry out there, small, medium, and large sized businesses. So we're able to draw our expertise and our information, and most importantly, the things that we're seeing that are really working at client locations from a wide pool of different types of businesses. And we're going to be sharing that information with you today. All right, so let's jump right in. Danielle, what all do we need to include in a recall policy? And honestly, I wasn't even sure that we actually needed one, and I appreciate having you on staff to walk us through what all actually needs to go into a recall policy.
Yeah, so I guess for starters, we should say, okay, you're recalling your staff, now what? Right, and I think that's where we should go as we enter into this slide, but we recommend the use of a recall policy and all of that paperwork so that you have clear expectations to your staff on what it is that they can expect upon a return to the workplace. So in this recall policy, we're going to suggest the company objective, saying, hey, here is why. You know, maybe we have experienced a loss of revenue due to this pandemic, or maybe we have restructured some different tasks and different positions in the company due to this COVID-19 pandemic. And it is further understood that we've laid off on this date, we gave you a notice on this date. Our objective is to get full up and running with our full head count and staff. and the communication of the notice inserted within that policy that's going to say, hey, here's how we're going to communicate with you. If and when you are recalled, you can expect to receive a letter or an email or a phone call. And that method will be by X amount of days, maybe 30 days, in which we're hoping to reevaluate. Within also the recall policy, it needs to be determined of your selection criteria. And what that means is, how can the employee expect to be recalled? And when do you think their time will be? How is the employer going to recall them? Are you going to choose by tenure? Are you going to choose by skill set, by job, by task, by performance? That all needs to be called out in the recall policy so that your employees can know what to expect upon a safe return. Length of service. So if you do choose the length of service to be determined as how you will recall, that's very typically inserted in the recall policy itself on how you're going to equate that and how you calculate that. How you're going to manage the recall list. Okay, we're going to have 5 staff members recalled, and you can expect within so many days, if we go through this list of 5 and they can't come back, then we're going to move to the next list. So that just kind of maps out the list management aspect of it. The method of communicating, like I said, either email, phone call, what can they expect and how can they expect to get it? And then how you're going to define seniority within the company. That's a big one, because typically that's, okay, well, let's just do first one in, first one out, or, you know, vice versa. And having a clear definition of how you're going to define what your seniority is as far as what they can expect for the recall.
So what size of business is this necessary for? If you have, 12 employees, do you still recommend going through this whole criteria?
Yeah, I mean, in our history and experience here, you could have 3, you can have upwards of 300. The more safeguarded you are in a clear documentation and selection process, the easier it will be to remain consistent. Sometimes I think we have those opportunities where, we all have biases, and how is that going to play out in the recall? Don't let it play out. You have this policy, stick with it, make sure that no one's adversely impacted, and go with it so that it prevents any of those biases to come forth. But it wouldn't matter if you are small, large, medium, this will help you in any regard.
Okay. Well, and I think we'll jump to this next slide that digs a little deeper, because I would imagine businesses with just a few employees find that list overwhelming. So let's break it down and really help a small business owner understand. I'm in your shoes. There's not really 2 people that do the same job. So it's going to be very difficult to determine who and how I can bring people back. And something like seniority may not play in at all. I've just got to cover the workload, and everybody has a different skill set. Very different than a large employer that may have 40 to 400 all doing the same job. That's when, if you're able to, let's say, recall half of those people, you really then want to look at that criteria. So I'm hearing you say both are important, but the reality is very different for different sizes of business.
Yeah, the overarching goal here is to avoid any type of perception of wrongful termination, because that's where things are going to go wrong in the workplace, right? And as it pertains to your rehiring decisions. And if you have any existing policies on recalls, then you should follow those in moving forward, if and when at all possible, just when you're determining who to recall first. But overall, just trying to avoid that misperception. A lot of times, we'll look at performance-based rehiring, and that's very common. The only words of encouragement I have with those are that we have to be sure that those choices are still objective, and that we have the documentation to prove such. So even, let's say, a smaller employer and it's a performance-based recall, as long as you've got documented performance reviews, corrective actions, or anything of that nature that support the ones who aren't being recalled and the ones that are, and vice versa, the most objective as possible, then that'll really safeguard you in moving towards, if you're using that selection criteria. If you're doing the reviews, they shouldn't be conducted for the purposes of recalling your staff, right? They should have already taken place. So these aren't reviews that we're going to say, okay, we're going to do performance-based recall, but this staff member has not performed, and we're going to hurry up and draft a performance review. That's not what we're encouraging in this moment, right? These performance reviews are thought to have already taken place, already on file prior to any other review periods. And there really is nothing wrong with favoring a high performer over a low performer. It's just making sure you've got that ample documentation to support it.
Okay. Continuing on.
Yeah, so we talk about selection criteria and we're like, okay, so what does that mean? We have a little bullet point of some options of the selection criteria you can use, whether that be seniority or tenure, as we discussed, performance, like we discussed, or experience in the industry. It could be education, skill set, performance and rehire interviews if you choose to move forward with those. So those are just some options that you can consider when we talk of selection criteria. That's kind of what we're referring to. And you can base those rehire decisions on any one of those factors, on a combination of those factors, as long as you avoid playing favorites and those biases, and really have the objective criteria that we're looking for. And again, when you have a recall policy, it maps this out for you. And so we've had a lot of success with our clients in utilizing a recall policy. It's almost like a checklist, if you will, to just go down and make sure you've covered all of your bases and you're staying consistent. So that safeguards you in the end.
Okay, so I'm just going to walk through a scenario with a small micro business. Let's say I have one accountant on staff and I have a front desk person who handles the incoming calls and sales calls. I have shut down my business, but now I'm ready to reopen, but I can only hire one person back. The front desk person has more seniority and maybe even more experience in the industry, but can't cover accounting, and I can't cover accounting. Therefore, my selection would be to bring the accountant back who could potentially cover the phone calls, but the other way doesn't work. Is that work-based criteria? I just want to make sure. I mean, sometimes you're truly, some people, whether they are high performers and very tenured, just can't do the essential job function that is most critical for my operation.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example, and that absolutely, you'd go on skill set. So you're going to choose what works for the business and what works for you all. Now, great attention has to be given to, any adverse impact that may cause if you have that other individual who might be in a protected class, how you're going to handle that. But again, this use of the recall policy, clearly outlining to everyone what you're going to choose on, really kind of mitigates your risk there. But in that scenario, it would be on skill set. Our skill set is what we need to have these tasks done. And we're going to reallocate some of the other tasks of the office manager until we can move forward through the circumstance.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, so telling a business owner they need to draft letters is, I can also imagine, a little intimidating. Walk us through what this letter is and how to put it together.
Yeah, and the letter is really important because it follows up on, hopefully we have already had a letter of our layoff. It follows up that they received that notice on such a date and that you are officially excited to call them back to work, and that they are expected to return on a certain date, and then your take on that if they don't. So the goal here is to be able to communicate to this to employees as soon as possible, even if the date is not in the immediate future. You know, the more notice they have, the more they can make sure that their things are taken care of amidst a personal or professional matter. The more likely you are also to retain those workers. You know, we're hoping that they'll clear schedules, get childcare back up and running, and prep themselves mentally as well to be back in the workplace. And to the extent some have found new jobs, and I think we'll touch on that further on in this webinar. It's just always the more time you can give yourself, the better, to determine who's going to come back and who isn't. In the recall letter, though, simply put, the date they can be expected to recall, who to get in touch with if they have questions, where to report to work and at what time, and your take on whether, if they choose to deny the recall or vice versa, then what is your take as an employer then moving forward? Are they going to be considered a voluntary resignation or case by case basis?
Okay, and also you're want to include some, certainly in today's recall letters, COVID preparedness. Yeah,
for sure. I think that kind of rounds out the recall letter, just a small blurb of, we're excited to have you back. You can expect to see a return to work, safety precautions in the near future. Just something to tell them that, hey, you are aware that might be a concern to them, and we're going to get you that information as soon as possible because it's important to us. Their well-being is important to the employer. And so, yes, that's kind of laid out vaguely at the end of the recall letter, and then the return to work program in its entirety, we're going to recommend be sent. As a rule of thumb, about a week's notice is kind of how we're going here and the trend that we've seen. And just to provide an update on any changes to operations they can expect when they go into the workplace.
I like the idea, the suggestion of letting us know by, right? So we'd like to recall you the following Monday. Please let us know by next Wednesday if you are accepting this recall position. It seems obvious, but you would think people are going to respond to you immediately, but sometimes they don't. And so just making it very clear that you need to know and plan and potentially go further down the list. We are finding that many laid off employees have found other work. We've helped clients through quite a few recalls in the last 2 months, I guess, as businesses reopened. And I was surprised by how many had found other work and were not interested in the recall when it came. Danielle, have you found that some people are just selecting to not take employment, or are most of them finding a different job and that's their the motivation for not accepting the recall?
You know, both, to be real honest with you here. For the ones who have found other employment, you know, that's going to, whether or not they're able to do that's going to fall back on if they have a collective bargaining agreement with that employer, and then what their rights are with that. And then whether or not there was a policy about outside work. But essentially, we're seeing both kind of in an equivalent equation here. People that just couldn't sit and wait, right, and had to make an honest living and were really trying to do that, but then in the search of doing so, refused the recall. And then on the flip side, we have staff members who simply refuse the recall because they're making more on unemployment in the current state as they would in the workforce. And so navigating that, the states have taken much different stances. Each state's very different on what their take is on that. And so it's handled on a case-by-case basis. But essentially speaking, you know, it's known that, you know, hey, you know, staying on unemployment for the purposes of gaining more money is just unlawful, and you know, how we're going to go through that. One strategy I do say to employers, if they have employees going that route, you know, not wanting to return just because they're making more money on unemployment, is communicate, because that employment right now is due to be gone by the end of July. And so, you know, weighing that out and communicating to your staff. But we've overall seen pretty split in the middle of those cases. One thing I do want to make note, super important here on your selection criteria, is kind of how this intertwines with EEOC too. And if you have further concerns or questions on this after the webinar, we'd be happy to help guide. But, you know, when you look at, you know, you might have scenarios where you think you're helping the employee, such as employees who may be pregnant or expecting, or employees who may be in the older population. And therefore you are presuming they're at higher risk and you're telling them, no, don't, you know, just stay at home and don't report to the workplace or what have you. Remember that the guidance from the public health officials is currently evolving, but during a pandemic, and especially now, let them be the overarching decision makers in that process. While you might think you're doing them a lot of good, you know, in a lot of cases, it's a sticky situation. So if you have further questions on that, we'd be happy to help answer. I just wanted to call that out.
So you're saying stick to your hiring criteria and let that employee self-select for high risk versus you making a judgment of their risk potential.
Right.
It may be a protected disability. Okay.
Right.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so finally on these letters, here's a nice list. Interesting about if their title changes or exemption changes, do I need a whole new job description, or can we just say, hey, we're all covering what we can cover right now?
No, you need a job description. You know, as much as you can. The job description is going to help the employee. And so if their tasks change, map that out in the job description, if at all possible. If their titles change, make note of that. You know, pretty much anything that you're expecting to see of a differentiation between when they were priorly in the workplace should be mapped out and documented. You know, we typically will put on the recall letters if nothing's changed, just to confirm your rate of pay is still the same, or your salary is still the same, the expected hours of work are still the same. They're going to be Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5. Your eligibility for PTO or vacation remains the same, and, you know, just kind of helping to answer their questions they may have before they even have them.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about phasing them back in. You know, you've made your criteria, you've sent your letters. Now what?
Yeah, so now it's getting your return to work plan and getting that out to them so they feel safe, because, okay, excitement is in them, they're returning to the workplace, and that's awesome. But then probably I'd wage to presume that very shortly after they're going to have feelings of fear a little bit.
Yeah.
Because, oh, I'm excited, now I'm fearful. What does that mean? And so the return to work program outlines the employer's steps that they're going to take in the situation of return to work and how they're going to do it to minimize exposure as much as possible. And then it tells the employee, you know, everything they're doing so that they can feel safer coming back. We recommend when you're looking to return the employees back to work that you do so in phases, and using seniority or other non-discriminatory factors for your selection. You might consider a 1-2 schedule. So schedule 1, half of the staff will come in, schedule 2, the other half of the staff will come in through differing days of the week or differing times. And then the schedule changes that are going to provide the greatest protection to those workers. And then letting them know that we believe this is going to provide the most protection for you, and you're the most important attribute to us. So creating that plan for your employees and communicating it. And then you're going to have your high risk categories, you know, those individuals who might be at high risk of contracting COVID, and what your take is going to be on them. Very typically, we'll see that within phase 1 or 2 of returning to the workplace, you know, really be flexible as much as possible still on a case-by-case basis, and make those accommodations if you can operationally possible for those individuals that may be at high risk, or maybe childcare is unavailable. And determine your measures that you're going to take to protect them if they are working off-site or on-site. Keeping in mind, even if they're working for you and it's off-site, you're still responsible for their well-being in the workplace. And then what's your take on notifying the state unemployment agency or other such agencies when that employee is recalled to work? And it's not a requirement, but it's going to help save you on taxes and other sorts. And determine.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to add that we had heard from the Missouri Department of Unemployment about really asking employers to update the recalled or the offered and rejected employment offers, because those employees are no longer then eligible for unemployment. And if you wait for the state to catch up on that, and they'll catch up because that employee is taxes are being paid in on that employee's behalf. But what may happen is that employee earns a week or two extra of unemployment, and then that money will be due back from them. So they're asking and saying that it's faster as an employer, if you've restarted, you've rehired, just send that update to them, and the instructions are on their website so that they know who to process and how. It also leads right into your next point, but they do also want to know the employees that you made an offer to that rejected coming back, because those employees in some cases may no longer be eligible for unemployment. And that is a very big discussion point right now with many employers who felt that employees elected to not come back to work because of the stimulus, additional federal unemployment money, making sometimes, in some cases, employees' wages higher on unemployment than if they were in the office or at the job site working. And we did see some of that. So some of this, again, is to keep everyone honest. The unemployment benefit is not intended for those who have a job offer. And quite literally, the Missouri department said it is illegal to take unemployment benefits for the sake of being on unemployment benefits. You do need to accept your job if offered back to you, or you don't have to accept it, but then you would no longer be eligible for the unemployment benefits. And so they are asking for employers' help to notify them through their website so that they can make it more seamless. And again, even the most well-intended employee is not going to want to have to pay back some of the benefit that they've already potentially received and spent. So keeping that up to date is what they're requesting. But Danielle, on your last point, talk a little bit about, we're still seeing employees fearful of coming to work. And so there's no one right size fits all for all employees. What advice are you offering?
Be flexible. That's my summed up response there as much as possible. But we've dealt a lot with that, and we've seen a lot of that. Employees who are fearful of coming to work, who may have family obligations. Maybe they're caring for a loved one who's experiencing symptoms, or their child has no care, or maybe they're being asked to remain under quarantine due to exposure. Each one of these is very, very different. And as long as you keep the mindset of being flexible and really offering that interactive dialogue to understand that person's circumstance, because everyone's circumstance is so different. For example, we have a client who has an employee who is just really fearful of returning to work because they don't want to contract the virus. We talk to them, we call them, we say, hey, we understand this is how you're feeling. Walk us through why you feel this way. The employee says, well, I am at high risk. I have type 1 diabetes. And also I have a newborn baby. If I get that baby, exposed, or if I'm exposed, then I'm a single parent or what have you. That's just a prime example of that opens up the door to then a level of empathy that we really need with our staff. So then that would be a little different, right? So then if you have an individual who's fearful and they're a type 1 diabetic, that puts them at high risk. If you can at all work with them and be flexible, accommodating to them, especially in the first 2 phases of your return to work, that's an example of dialogue that we have, for those employees who may have family obligations, maybe their childcare is unavailable. We're going to want to sit down and talk to them too. Walk us through this. Is your childcare shut down, or what does that look like? We had a staff member the other day who's saying childcare was not available, but in all actuality, after the conversation was had, she didn't feel safe sending her child. So
really difficult. It's a really difficult situation. And prior to the pandemic, we always said treat everyone the same. That way there's no room for bias or discrimination. But it's softened a little bit through this pandemic. And this truly is a business by business, case by case situation to think through. What we are seeing is professional services, office type setting. If there is any way to be flexible with a one-off scenario, it is encouraged to do, because the reality is that employee will get through the situation and return to being a full-time productive employee. If you are in a business where that is just not reasonable, you're a restaurant and you either need somebody cooking or they're not cooking, the recommendation there is, hey, can other people pick up shifts? Can we allow this employee to take additional leave because others are willing to take additional shifts? And is that feasible for your business? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And sometimes it just isn't, and you need to rehire because your business cannot sustain without an individual there standing cooking, let's say, for example. And that's reasonable too. But these are the very difficult challenges that business owners are facing through this situation, because there are many people in unique circumstances. There are fears from employers of forcing people back to work when the employee is fearful. But there are CDC, state and federal guidelines for employers. And you do have a lot of rights surrounding the employment of those individuals. But what we're saying is, if at all possible, give that extra leniency because of the situation. And that is the best practice that we're seeing, fully acknowledging that many industries can just absolutely not accommodate that type of scenario. Moving to the next slide, I think our final piece on these returning to work, Danielle, some additional suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, providing those safety procedures that you're going to take, address any safety related concerns, how you're going to handle leave issues. Essentially what needs to be happen here is that you're following federal, state, and local guidelines. You're letting them know how often you monitor that you're committed to their safety, right? Communicate the actions that you're taking is super important, and that's what this return to work plan is. It's communicating what you are doing to keep them safe in the work environment. Are you going to provide masks? Are you going to do hand sanitizer? Where can the employees expect to see those in the workplace? What is your take on how often they should be used, or you'd like them used? Offer that counseling as well in the return to work plan, if at all possible, if you're able to. Every employee is coming off such a very traumatic experience. We all are, and the more we can map out in that return to work plan things that can help them, we certainly better off will be. Limiting the number of people that may be in meetings or kind of maintaining your social distancing. What's your protocol on that? If you have different meeting rooms or conference rooms, what is their max capacity thought to be while still doing incorporating the social distancing? Maybe rethinking those in-person social gatherings. You may all still be physically in the workplace, but still thought best practice may be to keep those virtual meetings. Maybe ask employees to join a birthday celebration via Zoom as one fun thing to keep kind of morale up, and just rethink typical things that you used to do versus what you can do. And just once you have those return to work plans, knowing that it's still up for any type of change as this is ongoing, stick with them and train your management staff so that they understand too that a consistent message for staff is really important.
So this is almost like phase two, things you didn't think about, but are there policies that have changed now that we're living in a pandemic environment? And you think of, oh, hours of operation or attending meetings or visiting clients, travel, all of these non-urgent situations, but you've got a handbook and a policy around all of these things that may absolutely be different right now. How do
Yeah,
you handle that?
so right. Really adapting to the change of the workforce now. Um, I would make the recommendation to review such policies and really make sure, are they applicable now? For example, you might have a policy that says absolutely no remote work and teleworking is permitted in the workplace. Well, it's a little different now. So what's the employer's take going to be on that moving forward? Maybe you have a form or something to fill out to complete this return to work, or maybe it's simply in certain scenarios will return to work be permitted. Just kind of a more of a leniency there, if at all possible. And then what's your take on reporting of exposures or symptoms? I would wage to bet that most handbooks didn't have or include a communicable disease prevention policy up until now. And that's okay, because it wasn't the way that we were going. And now that's a big deal. And how you're going to handle not just COVID, but any other communicable disease moving forward. It's really allowed us time to think through some things. Before this pandemic also, we weren't wanting to take temperatures of staff. That was providing us employers information that we wouldn't otherwise be privy to. Now that it's a pandemic, we're allowed to, and in some cases, really look at doing. If you do that, when and how are you going to do that? What is your threshold of accepting? Making sure you lean on CDC guidance. And the overall message too is saying that it doesn't mean that one system, or that one symptom rather, means that we're free of all communicable diseases. But so on and so forth, you get the gist of just lots of things have changed, and it's the time now to look at updating and revising.
I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again because I see it consistently across all businesses right now. Do not be surprised with the one-off reaction that is different than the rest of the group. I see businesses that say everybody wanted to return to the office. They hated missing out on that camaraderie. I have others that say we've done a poll and everybody wants to remote work still, or have some version of that going forward. But one thing underlying is that there is a 1 in 20, I'd say, reaction that is very different than the main group. And do not be surprised by that. It feels surprising because you think, hey, this one person is going away from the norm, is reacting abnormally from the others. And our recommendation and our observation is that's just the reality of what's going on. And that is no reflection of that employee's commitment, even necessarily their risk factor or home environment. It is just how people are mentally processing the information that is very different depending on where you're reading it and where you're getting that information. But there is a group of people in almost every business that I have talked with that is kind of united in, hey, I want to be at work, or I'm working well from home, or whatever. They're all kind of in the zone. And then a 1 or 2 off that it doesn't respond, isn't functioning well, is just flat out not interested in coming back. And you think, why is this one person thinking so differently? And the reality is that people are just dealing with this very different. And so I just encourage you, it's very common for the business owner or the manager to think something else must be going on. And I really don't think that's the case. I think that people are just processing the situation very differently. Danielle, is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, really allowing that dialogue to understand what they're going through is kind of the least we can do as employers as they're coming off a trauma. I mean, this is a trauma for sure. And understanding and empathizing with how everyone's digesting this and everyone's circumstance is so different. I always like to say too, sometimes separate the problem from the person. And I think that will help too if we keep that in mind as we move forward. And if you have that one-off employee, sometimes we think as leaders, we associate it with the person themselves and really separate the problem from the person. And when you're doing that, that's going to then have you to address some of these emotions they may be feeling. And sometimes you can't get past that to even address the problem. But essentially, yes, everyone is very, very different. Take the time to understand what scenario they might be in. I'm seeing the same thing as you.
All right, we're going to move into some commonly asked questions. If you are a participant and you hover over your navigation bar, you will see a chat feature, and it may be hidden under the dots, the 3 dots that say more, but pull up your chat and feel free to type in some questions. Anything it can be on the table. So I'll be monitoring those as we move forward. But Danielle, let's talk about a commonly question that we've somewhat covered is, can an employee refuse a recall to work and still collect unemployment?
Overall, the answer is going to be no, they shouldn't. But again, this is going to be on a case-by-case basis through each eyes of every different state, right? And so what is the state's take on it? If they are refusing a recall, what are the reasonings why they're refusing it? Overall, what we're finding the answer to be is no. It's up to the state to decide on, whether or not that person will be eligible for unemployment. Are they caring for someone who might be experiencing symptoms of? It just depends. But overall, the answer is usually no.
The employer will notify the state that they've made a recall, that employee refused work, and then it's up to that individual employee to work with the state to dispute that and maybe bring forward some sort of high risk scenario. And we're seeing some states that do allow or will make certain exceptions. But in general, the fear from employers that people could just sit on unemployment and not work is technically illegal unless they get some sort of exception, but that would be between them and the state. Okay, next question. When we're calling employees back to work, do we need to have the employees complete new hire paperwork? You talked about the job description and policy manual. What about the tax forms and the job offer and all that stuff?
I'm going to say here, what I want to make note of, it depends on for how long they're out of work too. But in most cases, no. You don't want to make it more difficult for that employee to come back to work, get started. Sometimes that just kind of muddies the waters and makes it really hard. If the employees weren't separated from payroll, documenting the layoff and furlough dates is way sufficient. Make sure those are in the personnel files. But if you do have those significant changes, like we talked about, a new job title, new pay rate, make sure those are reflected on a new document. Otherwise, if it's, in a reasonable amount of time, no.
I have a question that is, employees are able to work from home during the pandemic, but are now being recalled to the office. There are some employees who feel they were fully functional at home and productive, and out of health concerns or fear or any number of reasons are requesting to still telecommute because the employee specifically feels that they're just as productive as when they're in the office.
I've seen a lot of that. My take is it's also going to, before we answer this, it's going to really depend on what their policy is on the return to work, and then stick with that. So for example, if this person is not at high risk, if they're not caring for an individual at high risk, or childcare is unavailable or what have you, and they just don't want to return to work and they are an essential part of the organization, you need them there now to kind of wrangle back, I'd say making sure you lean on your policy and what your threshold is going to be and accepting that. Still remaining as flexible as you can. If they're fearful, can you work with them on adopting maybe a Monday, Wednesday, Friday be back in the office, or maybe they can be in the office at times where it's not as heavily populated if they're fearful of. But overall, if it's just out of fear or not fear, they just want to work from home, the employer still has the responsibility to map out their expectations and stick with them.
Yeah, and I think in this case, the chat is saying there's no formal policy, and I'm fairly confident that many businesses don't have a formal policy because it just is not, it wasn't the norm prior to that. I would say that the advice we're giving the business owners is that CDC, state, federal, and local governments are issuing the guidance on who and what business can be open and if people can be working. So when those, what I'm guessing in this particular case is it was a non-essential business or a non-essential department that had the ability to remote work. Now that order is lifted and that business is legally able to work in the office. Therefore, that employer does have the right to recall those employees back into the office following local, state, federal CDC guidelines. But in the Kansas City, Missouri area, for example, businesses do have the right to reopen or require employees to work on site, providing that they're giving the space for social distancing, the cleaning materials, et cetera, to create a safe environment. So it's probably not what the employees want to hear, but that's what I am advising employers is follow your city and state and county because we're all getting a little bit different guidance on that. But if the employer has the ability to reopen, which in Kansas City and both sides of the state line right now, they do. Again, some are at half capacity, like a restaurant or something like that. Then the employer has the right to do that. Back to the HR side of things, if at all possible, be flexible if you can. But if work productivity, if the business deems it necessary to be in the office, then at this point, they do have the right to make that decision, is my take. So it's very difficult, I know, for all parties, but that's where we're at today. May we ask an employee to get tested for COVID-19 before returning to work?
Well, you can consistently, but I think the question here is, do you want to do that and have that liability as an employer? So you can ask that they be tested for the virus before they come in, but not everyone's going to have that immediate testing capability, and it just might not be practical. And also, I want to refer to the CDC on this too, because like all of the rest of moving through this pandemic, their guidance has changed a little bit. They are now giving 2 options for employers to be encouraged to use when returning to the workplace on this testing. They're giving like option 1, okay, employee is not being tested, whether or not that is they refuse, then here are the guidelines you follow. And they're giving option 2, okay, the employee is being tested, and then here are the guidelines you follow. So refer back to the CDC. If you're not signed up to receive their updates via email, I highly suggest you do that. But short answer is yes, you can require them to, as long as that's done consistently. But also keep in mind, you may have individuals who, from a disability standpoint, they may be asthmatic, they may have something going on where that apparatus around their face is really not suggested from their health service provider. I mean, lots of different cases to consider. One take on that may be to say, we're going to handle the testing of COVID. If symptoms should occur, and here's our take on that, we're going to follow CDC guidance of option 1 and option 2.
Along those same lines, I've seen questions come through for us like, should I mandate that an employee go gets tested because they said somebody at their church had an uncle that got, we hear all these scenarios. We all know a 3rd degree of separation. when they call and tell us that, but they're not sick, do we send them out for a test, or what's your advice?
Health service provider. Let them do what they do best, right? So if your employee comes to you, they're experiencing symptoms, immediately refer them to the health service provider. Put that onus on them. Let them do the evaluations. They're the professionals in that regard. Whether or not they ask for them to be tested or not, then follow the CDC's guidelines on what to do after that.
And so even if they're not showing symptoms, they just say, hey, I was exposed, or I saw this, or whatever, you should, the direction, and I agree, is call your health provider and let them walk you through what they think is best for your specific scenario. And not try and dictate that, other than dictate, certainly if anyone feels ill, stay home. What do you, wearing masks and the guidelines around that are changing daily. As of today, what are you helping business owners communicate to staff about best practices on mask wearing in the office? Do I wear it at my desk, as I walk through the office, the whole time? What?
Best practice, what we're seeing, and this is coming from the CDC as well, is make sure to wear your mask if you're in the office, and especially if you are experiencing scenarios where the 6-foot social distancing can't be practical or can't be obtained. We are seeing different states, municipalities, counties, cities coming out with a mandate in public spaces that you must wear a mask. And but I think the kicker here is if you can't do that 6-foot social distancing, if it's impossible for you to do that, if it's not practical. So a good policy on that would be, for employees, if they are within their office or in a restricted space, they can take it off. However, in any scenario where they get up from that space or 6-foot social distancing is not practical, then we're going to ask that you wear it.
Okay. Here's one I see that's very difficult. An employee complains to HR that the person next to them has a cough and it's making them uncomfortable. What does HR do?
You're going to talk to the employee. You're going to explain the symptoms of COVID. That's an ever-growing list.
Yeah.
You're going to ask them to see their health service provider for extra input. That's my take on what to do. And I think that's what the CDC would say to do as well. Important to keep in mind that this is allergy season too. And, but very often if you have that scenario, the employee might have already recognized it themselves, right? And have been in touch with their physician, or maybe they had said, what, it is allergies. I've been in touch with my doctor. But that's what the overall message you're wanting to send is, hey, can you make sure you're in touch with your physician here? It's one of the symptoms, and we just want to be safe. We want to keep them safe and us safe.
And so during a pandemic, you do have the right to bring that up with the employee, where sometimes discussing their personal medical situation is not relevant. In this scenario, it is, and you have the rights to have that kind of discussion if you're observing those type of, again, kind of every symptom is a symptom with COVID. We are, every day it is a different state that if you've traveled there, now you've got to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. And this is vacation season. So just yesterday it changed, and added Florida. So let's say we've got employees in Florida on vacation today. Now they have to come back and self-quarantine for 2 weeks. This seems nearly impossible for a business owner to navigate through. What kind of oversight or rules can an employer possibly put on vacation travel when it's not going to be the same by the time the vacation actually happens?
Yeah, you can't really restrict what they do on their personal time, right? Your staff. But what you can do is sign up for the local health departments and the states in which you might be of concern to. Maybe they're routinely visited by your staff, and try to stay abreast of the situations through those routes. Oftentimes your staff will probably share with you where they're going, and because they're excited and eager to go. And then just working with them, and if they are self-quarantine, what you can do is say, hey, we're going to ask that we respect the state's guidelines and allow you to telecommute, for those 14 days. And that's really all from an employer standpoint. You certainly can't restrict what they do with their own time, but there are measures you can take that are in accordance with federal, state, and local guidelines.
But if this is like an hourly, again, restaurant worker, and they come back and the employer can mandate that they quarantine for 14 days because that's the state guidelines. So that would be technically unpaid time.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because telecommuting in that case is not an option.
No.
The last question I have before we end is, everybody is getting emails now from restaurants, social groups, etc., that somebody at that location has tested positive. And it's like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon scenario of, they come to you and they say, I got this email and I went to that restaurant a week ago, and what am I supposed to do? So how many levels of exposure before an employee should quarantine? Because it's becoming just constant.
The CDC depicts that.
Okay.
The CDC depicts that per your industry, and they have greatly expanded their website. So again, I hate to be like a broken record with referring back to them, but you really can't go wrong if you refer back to the CDC, because they have expanded guidance that's going to be for hospitality industries, guidance that's going to be for restaurant industries, and so on and so forth, healthcare industries. Their guidance is going to be different. So it just depends on what industry in which we're referring to. But my answer is always to lean on federal, state, local guidelines, as well as the CDC. They'll be able to walk you through what they consider okay for whatever specific industry. Like, for example, if we're talking the restaurant industry, the CDC has a separate guiding page and bullet points all on the restaurant industry, and what they recommend you do for actions if an individual is thought to have been exposed or in direct contact. They then go on to define what is direct contact. And then for those individuals who have indirect contact, and then what the industry is guided to do. So it just differs by industry. For the restaurant, I should say, I just recently read that they ask, for you to map off that area in which people could have been, notifications to such individuals who might have been in contact, and then a certain amount of time you let the airflow and cleaning and disinfecting, but it is really determined upon your scenario and your industry.
Okay, well, thank you. That has been such a great help, and probably created more questions that, for some of our participants. But good news, we have more information and more webinars coming. On your screen, you see the Eventbrite link to register for additional webinars with the Women's Business Center. And we will be back for one more HR session next Wednesday, same time, same place. And we look forward to you joining us there. In addition, our information was on the last screen. Please do not hesitate to reach out to Danielle or I with any of your questions, and we can help forward you on to those resources that we mentioned throughout today's presentation. Thank you all again for joining us, and stay well during this time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.